If you grew up in Britain, there is a decent chance Wilko felt less like a shop and more like part of the furniture. It was one of those places that somehow sold absolutely everything and absolutely nothing at the same time. You would go in for bleach and come out with a bag of compost, a washing up bowl, some batteries, a framed canvas of a Highland stag, and maybe a packet of pick and mix for the walk home. It was cheap, familiar, and on a lot of British high streets, it felt permanent. Which is why Wilko's collapse in 2023 felt so strange. Here was a business founded in 1930, a chain that had survived war, recession, inflation, and decades of change on the British high street, a chain with more than 400 stores at its peak. And yet, by the autumn of 2023, Wilko was gone. Around 12,000 jobs were at risk, stores were shuttered, suppliers were left exposed, and one of Britain's most recognizable retail names had collapsed into administration. So what actually happened? Because Wilko did not collapse because people suddenly stopped needing washing up liquid, storage boxes, and light bulbs. And it did not collapse because 2023 was simply a difficult year for retail. Wilko collapsed because the business spent too long standing still while the world around it changed. And by the time it realized how much trouble it was in, it was already too late. This is the story of how one of Britain's best-known high street chains lost its way. Wilko began life in Leicester in 1930 when James Kemsey Wilkinson opened a single hardware store on Charnwood Street. It was a simple proposition, practical household goods at affordable prices. That was the heart of the business from the start. This was not glamorous retail, it was useful retail, the kind of place ordinary families relied on for the bits and pieces of everyday life. And for decades, that formula worked brilliantly. Wilkinson Hardware Stores, as it was originally known, expanded steadily through the Midlands and then across the country. By the end of the 1980s, it had 78 stores. By the end of the 1990s, it had more than 150. By the 2000s, it had become a major national retailer, eventually growing to more than 400 stores across the UK. It sold homeware, DIY products, decorating supplies, garden equipment, cleaning products, pet care, stationery, seasonal goods, all the things that do not feel exciting until you need them immediately. And that was Wilko's strength. It occupied a very specific place in British retail. It was not trying to be aspirational. It was not trying to be trendy. It was a value retailer with a broad range, positioned somewhere between a hardware shop, a household store, and a general high street bargain chain. When Woolworths collapsed in 2008, Wilko looked well placed to pick up some of that same customer base, people who wanted convenience, familiarity, and decent value, all in one place. By the 2010s, it looked like the sort of chain that would just keep going forever. But underneath that familiar red and white branding, the foundations were starting to weaken. One of the most important things to understand about Wilko is that it remained a family-owned business for the vast majority of its life. That had benefits. Family ownership can mean patience, long-term thinking, and a strong sense of identity, but it can also create blind spots. And by the 2010s, Wilko looked increasingly like a business that was too comfortable with the model that had worked in the past and too slow to adapt to the world it was actually operating in. The retail environment around Wilko was changing fast. Online shopping was becoming more important. Town centre footfall was under pressure. Retail parks were becoming more attractive for discount chains. Competitors like B&M, Poundland, and Home Bargains were getting sharper, bigger, and more efficient. They were building businesses around large, easy-access stores, aggressive pricing, and leaner operating models. Wilko, meanwhile, was still heavily tied to the traditional high street, and that mattered. Because the high street that had made Wilko successful was no longer the high street of the 1990s, a lot of Wilko stores were in town centres, often in large, expensive units with long leases. That model made sense when the high street was still the centre of everyday shopping, but by the 2020s it was becoming a burden. Footfall was down, shopping habits had changed, customers were increasingly driving to retail parks, doing larger basket shops, or ordering online. Wilko was paying premium costs to trade in places that were delivering less and less value in return. And unlike some of its competitors, it never really found a convincing answer to that shift. There was also a deeper strategic problem. Wilko began to lose clarity over what it actually was. For years, the business had done well by being straightforward, practical products, decent prices, no nonsense. But at various points, Wilko tried to modernize its image and move slightly upmarket, introducing more design-led homeware and trying to position itself as something a little more stylish, a little more contemporary, a little less bargain bin. On paper, that sounds reasonable. Retailers have to evolve. The problem is that Wilko's core customer was not looking for a mini John Lewis. They were looking for value. They wanted cheap paint, cheap cleaning products, cheap storage, cheap garden supplies, cheap essentials. Wilko's strength was that it was useful and affordable. Once it started drifting away from that identity, it risked becoming muddled. Not premium enough to justify higher prices, not cheap enough to beat the discounters, and not convenient enough to compete with online retail. But even then, a business can survive strategic confusion if the basics still work. Wilko's basics stopped working, and the biggest self-inflicted wound of the lot was the supply chain. In the years before the collapse, Wilko invested in a program intended to modernize its logistics and distribution network. In theory, that should have helped the business. Better stock flow, better availability, more efficient operations. But in practice, it became one of the most damaging episodes in the company's decline. The new supply chain setup created serious disruption. Stock was not reaching stores properly. Shelves were left empty. Best-selling items were not where they needed to be. And for a retailer like Wilko, that is catastrophic. Because Wilko was not the kind of shop people visited for a leisurely browse and a coffee. It was a functional shop. People went there because they needed something. Cat litter, storage boxes, light bulbs, compost, toilet cleaner, and if those things were not on the shelf, customers did not shrug and come back next week. They went somewhere else. Tesco, B&M, Home Bargains, Poundland, the supermarket down the road. And once you train customers to stop relying on you, winning them back is incredibly difficult. This is where Wilko's decline becomes less about one bad decision and more about a chain reaction. Sales were already under pressure, costs were rising, competition was intensifying, but then the stores themselves stopped functioning properly because stock availability became unreliable. The supply chain problems did not just hurt profit margins, they damaged the basic trust between the customer and the shop. If Wilko cannot reliably sell me the boring household things I came in for, why am I making a special trip to Wilko at all? The financial picture reflected that decline. Wilko's turnover had been falling for years. Revenue peaked at around £1.6 billion in 2018, then slipped down to roughly £1.24 billion by the year, ending February 2022. In 2022, the company reported a pre-tax loss of around £35.9 million. These were not minor bumps. This was a retailer losing sales, losing momentum, and losing cash at exactly the moment it needed to invest in fixing the business. And this is where the most controversial part of the Wilko story comes in, because while the business was clearly under strain, money was still being extracted from it. In the years before the collapse, the Wilkinson family and related trusts received millions in dividends. Across a longer period, the figure often cited is around £77 million in total distributions. Lisa Wilkinson later defended those payments, arguing that they were made when the company had the reserves to support them and that they were standard corporate practice. Because when you look at Wilko in its final years, what you see is a business that desperately needed cash. It needed investment in stores, investment in systems, investment in e-commerce, investment in supply chain resilience, investment in making itself relevant in a changing retail market. Instead, a huge amount of money had already been taken out of the business over time, and once the crisis deepened, there was not enough left to absorb the shock. To be fair to Wilko, not all of its problems were self-inflicted. The external environment was brutal. Brexit disruptions pushed up supply chain costs and delays. The pandemic changed shopping habits. Inflation surged. Energy costs rose. Interest rates climbed. Consumer confidence weakened. The Liz Truss mini-budget in 2022 triggered market chaos and increased financial pressure on already vulnerable businesses. If you were a retailer in Britain in 2022 or 2023, you were not operating in an easy environment. But here is the problem with using that as the main explanation. Wilko's competitors were living through exactly the same economy. B&M was there, Home Bargains was there, Poundland was there. They were all dealing with inflation, weak consumer confidence, and rising costs. They were all selling to cash-strapped households, and yet they were not collapsing. In fact, some of them were growing. That does not mean the economy was irrelevant. It means Wilko was already too weak to survive it. By 2023, the business was in serious trouble. It needed a cash lifeline to keep trading, restock stores, and reassure suppliers. It secured financing from Hilco Capital, reportedly worth around £40 million, but it was a temporary fix rather than a solution. The bigger problem was confidence. Once suppliers and credit insurers start to worry about a retailer's survival, the spiral becomes vicious. If suppliers no longer trust that they will be paid, They stop shipping stock unless they are paid up front. If you do not have the cash to pay up front, stock dries up. If stock dries up, sales fall further. If sales fall further, the cash position gets worse. At that point, you are no longer running a struggling retailer. You are watching a retailer die in real time. That is essentially what happened to Wilko in the summer of 2023. On the 3rd of August, the company filed a notice of intention to appoint administrators. A week later, on the 10th of August 2023, Wilko formally entered administration. Around 12,000 jobs were suddenly hanging in the balance. At first, stores continued trading while administrators tried to find a buyer or a rescue deal, but no full rescue emerged. By September, closures began, redundancies followed, stores were shut in waves, and by early October, the chain as people knew it was finished. What followed was a very modern British retail ending. The Wilko business itself died, but the carcass was picked apart for the bits that still had value. The range, owned by Chris Dawson through CDS Superstores, bought the Wilko brand, website and intellectual property for around £5 million. Poundland took dozens of former Wilko stores. Other rivals picked up leases where it suited them. Some sites reopened under different names. Others were simply left behind, empty shells in struggling town centres, too expensive or too awkward for anyone else to want. And that, in a way, tells you almost everything about Wilko's collapse. The brand still had value, the name still meant something, customers still remembered it fondly, but the underlying estate, the actual stores, the cost base, the operating model, was broken. The parts that could be separated from that burden were worth buying, the rest were not. The human cost, though, was far more serious than a few asset sales. Thousands of staff lost their jobs. Redundancy handling was criticized. Unions accused the company and administrators of poor communication, with some workers learning about closures through rumors or news reports before being formally informed. Because the business was insolvent, the cost of redundancy largely fell to the taxpayer through the government's redundancy payment system, reportedly running into tens of millions of pounds. Suppliers were also left exposed, from huge multinational brands right down to smaller firms for whom a hit like that can be devastating. And that is what makes Wilko feel bigger than just another retailer went bust. Wilko's collapse is really a story about the collapse of a certain kind of British high street business model. For most of the 20th century, you could build a strong national retailer by putting large stores in town centres, selling useful everyday goods at decent prices, and relying on habit, loyalty, and footfall. Wilko was built for that world. The problem is that by the 2020s, that world had changed. Customers had changed. Retail geography had changed. Competition had changed. Logistics had changed. The economics of the high street had changed. And Wilko never adapted quickly enough. It held onto too many expensive stores. It failed to modernize fast enough. It allowed supply chain issues to damage the customer experience. It lost strategic clarity. And while all of that was happening, it did not protect its balance sheet with anything like the urgency the moment demanded. So was Wilko's collapse avoidable? I think the honest answer is yes, but only years earlier. Not in the final weeks, when suppliers were nervous, shelves were empty, and administrators were circling. By that point, the game was basically up. But if Wilko had aggressively restructured its estate earlier, invested properly in operations, sharpened its identity, protected cash, and treated the changing high street as an existential threat rather than an inconvenience, then yes, I think there is a version of this story where Wilko survives. Maybe smaller, maybe leaner, maybe with 250 stores instead of 400, maybe more retail park locations, more e-commerce, fewer legacy costs, but still alive. Instead, Wilko became one of the clearest examples of what happens when a heritage retailer mistakes familiarity for security. People loved Wilko. That was never really the issue. The issue was that love from customers does not save a business on its own. Nostalgia does not fix a broken supply chain. A recognizable logo does not make your rents cheaper. And a long history means very little if the business underneath it no longer works. For decades, Wilko was one of those shops that felt like it would always be there. Part hardware store, part bargain shop, part accidental cultural institution of the British high street. But in the end, it turned out to be far more fragile than it looked. And Wilko will not be the last. Because if a chain that was this familiar, this established, and this embedded in British life can disappear in a matter of weeks, then the question is not really why Wilko collapsed. It is which name on the high street might be next.